Thank you. I am so pleased to be joined today by James Harrison. James describes himself as a serial entrepreneur, and I know that he's an acclaimed leader in cybersecurity and identity theft. His company, Invisus, has been staying ahead of the curve in bringing cybersecurity, identity theft, and digital defense solutions that are particularly relevant for mid-sized businesses like the firms that are part of Meritas. This specialized focus is one of the reasons that Invisus was selected to help Meritas both manage our own cybersecurity preparedness, but also to create a set of standards for our firms. These standards are designed to provide an assurance to our clients that each of you are following some of the best practices in the industry. So James, thank you so much for taking some time to speak with us today. I know it'll be really valuable for our firms, particularly as they're trying to stay ahead of this very constantly shifting area that impacts their law firm management. So thank you for joining me today. I do appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Wonderful to be here.
Great. So I thought, James, we might start with, you recently joined a couple of Meritas member partners from KJK to co-author an article regarding remote work and cybersecurity. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more, particularly, I think one of the reasons why that topic was so important is there was an urgent response to law firms beginning to work remotely as the health crisis began to spread across the country and across the globe. And I think now, as we're in this phase where we're starting to realize this is a more of an enduring way of working, it's really timely that we think about this carefully. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you're seeing out in the marketplace in terms of how the cyber threat might have been evolving over the last several months, and what is that context that we should be thinking about these questions in?
Yeah, you betcha. There's just as a headline, if you want to look at headlines, the number of data breach incidents has jumped 10 to 15% since people started working from home. And they've tracked that back to sort of the beginning of the COVID pandemic and people moving to home to go to work. And literally within 60 days, they had already tracked a 10 to 15% jump in data breaches. Then they dug a little bit deeper and said, well, what's the threat? Why did this jump all of a sudden happen? And this is when the industry really, our industry in cybersecurity, when we really started evaluating the movement of hackers and cyber criminals and how are they taking advantage of this trend of people moving into a home work environment. And it was quickly discovered that the home environment for home office purposes is nowhere near as safe typically as is the traditional office space, where the IT staff can control the environment pretty tightly. When the workers, employees started moving home, we found that phishing attacks spiked in a big way towards workers who are working from home. Of course, cyber criminals don't know who's working from home and who's not, but they launched a flurry of phishing emails. That's only relevant because in an office environment, sometimes you can talk a lot more about these things, or your IT staff is more vigilant about notifying everybody about certain things happening. And in a distributed environment or a remote environment, that communication breakdown is one of the first weaknesses that not just law firms, that every business really faces. So if you can't effectively communicate about these threats that are emerging and keep your staff aware, prepared, they fall easier. They fall victim to different scams and different things. And so phishing attacks was really the first spike that we saw. From phishing attacks, of course, we looked at ransomware and the impact that ransomware was having in the home office environment, and we saw spikes there. And from those attack vectors in the home environment, the breaches were happening because the hackers were moving quickly from that home environment in through the back door, through VPNs, through any number of connection tools, right into the office network, right into the servers, and able to affect the entire organization. So the home office environment created a whole new set of threats and risks that most companies were not prepared to handle. I think what most companies did is they focused on the connectivity. How do we just connect?
Right.
How do we work together? You know, the pure functionality of staying in business. And so security sort of took a back seat role for a lot of people, and it has to become a front seat item on people's agenda, whether that's management or whether that's IT or everybody. But you've got to put security as a front seat agenda item.
Yeah. And I noticed you mentioned in the article about the need to evaluate remote workforce plans and fix where some of those weaknesses might be. Excuse me. Do you have specific advice that you're giving to organizations right now? What are like maybe the top 3 things that they should go back and take a look at?
Yeah, if you haven't thought through a formalized remote workforce plan that starts with connectivity but then adds security to it, you've got to really think through all the components of it. And connectivity is really not just about productivity, but it's about security. That VPN network, that connection into the network, that has to be evaluated from a security standpoint. There's a couple of key things that you should make sure you have in that strategy. Number 1 is multi-factor authentication, MFA. Everybody should be looking for ways to do multi-factor authentication from a mobile device or from a laptop or whatever, from a home environment, to connect into the network through a VPN. It's not enough just to have a VPN. Typically, best practice is to source or seek out multi-factor authentication. We don't personally provide that as a company, but I know that that's a best practice out there. So that's one of them. Another one is a training component. You need to make sure that everybody has proper training. There are certain best practices and protocols that employees should be following when they're working in a home environment. For example, are you going to isolate that computer in that home office to just work purposes? Or are other family members in the home environment allowed to use that machine, that computer? And if so, what's the login credentials to that? Are there separate logins? How does all that work? That should be established up front when you send somebody home to work or when they choose to work from home. Access rights or access rights management, knowing who has access to the devices, and then from that point, who could potentially get into the network. If you have a family at home, we recommend you isolate that computer off, and it's a work computer only. Get a different computer for family purposes. That way there's that layer of defense in there. But access rights and access rights management is an interesting question. Employees really ought to be kind of hand in hand in agreement with you on this. It's not something that should be a battle or a question. It's just, this is how we do safety. This is how we manage our privacy and our security. This is the way that it is. Some of the recommendations that we make is that training wise, training how to connect in securely, how to watch for phishing emails, how to report a cybersecurity incident. If something were to happen, if your machine is infected with a virus or a piece of malware and you have red flags going off, who do you report that to and how? Right? These are little protocols that you should have in your remote workforce plan. And then beyond that, potentially from an HR perspective, maybe have an information security agreement signed by that employee who's working from home. And there's 2 components to that. One is really just the employee saying, yes, I've been trained, I understand the company's stance on privacy and security, and I agree to live by the company's standards there. And the other part of that, or the other component to that, potentially is a BYOD policy. It's a bring your own device policy. If you're going to use your own personally owned equipment at home rather than corporate provided equipment, then the firm really needs to have some rights to manage that computer, even though it's personally owned. As an example, if you have a laptop that goes missing, or let's just say you're using an iPad or an iPhone or an Android phone or whatever, if those are stolen or missing, what rights do you have to control as a company the ability to remotely wipe that device, so that if there was data on that device stored locally on that device, how do you protect it from becoming a data breach, right? Yeah. The best way to do that is to delete the device, to remove it. But you need to have permission typically from the employee when they're using their own personal equipment to have those rights to interact with that employee on that level. So there's kind of some give and take when it comes to that remote work environment. Many firms are allowing them to use their own personal equipment at home, which is fine. But some are also now saying, no, you're going to use our equipment, and we're going to make sure that our security software is on it and all that. So if you're going to allow them to use their own equipment, they call that a BYOD arrangement, bring your own device. You have to ask questions like, what antivirus is running on that machine? You know, what security protocols are there? Who's patching and updating it? Right. Who's keeping it secure when Windows updates or Apple updates? Who's keeping it current with the latest security patches? Most firms have a fairly assertive IT staff that maintains those things on corporate-owned equipment, but when it comes to your own personal-owned equipment, it gets a little fuzzy, and you've got to establish those protocols on how to do that. Sometimes some of the best practices would be to outsource that functionality to the remote workforce. In other words, if the IT staff doesn't have the tools or the desire or whatever to remotely manage everything on a extended network, you know, out across the country and around the world, perhaps, you know, utilizing a third-party source like us to manage that, to do those checkups, to make sure security is working properly, that the employee is following all the best practices. The teenager didn't turn off the firewall so they can download game codes, right? Right. If those kinds of checks and balances aren't done on a regular basis in a home environment, security gaps are going to happen. But I've touched on a number of points there, but
yeah, no, and that's really helpful as you talked about some of the ways that people have to be shifting their focus and their plans. I'm wondering if, as you've been sort of working with clients now over the last several months, are you finding that most organizations are adequately prepared to address the question? I understand there's sort of a need to reassess. Is the plan in place going to be sufficient? But what's been your experience just in terms of how adequately are we ready to take those action items? Do we have the right staffing, budget? Do you see big changes coming in how organizations are doing that?
In the legal world, the legal industry, we're actually quite pleased with the progress that we see our clients making. Most of them have pretty astute staff in the IT area that have immediately taken upon the role of establishing secure connections from remote workers into the office environment. The smaller the firm, in our experience, the higher the risk in terms of not crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's, you know, meeting all of the little details that need to be done. But the mid-size and the larger firms, they've been fairly aggressive at pursuing it, and they're allocating budget. And it honestly, in our opinion, is driven out of a need to create a productive remote environment. You know, that's the first objective. Is data available? Can we get to our client files? You know, can we do our work remotely? And once that's established, I think security kind of goes hand in hand with that for most firms, where they start asking the questions. I think some of the areas where the larger firms might be perhaps slipping a little bit is in the constant monitoring and security checkups in that remote workforce. This is a concept that we talk a lot about. If there were an area of improvement that we see, we think that that's it. It's the ongoing maintenance, the ongoing management of a remote environment. We recommend regular cybersecurity checkups in the home office environment.
When you say regular, can you give us, is regular every 6 months, every year, much more than that?
Yeah, every 6 months at a minimum. Sometimes we might recommend quarterly because they're 30 to 45-minute checkups. You know, sometimes you might want to do it a little more often depending on the circumstances, but a minimum every 6 months have a full cybersecurity checkup done in that home environment. And what I'm talking about specifically is not just the computer that they use. I'm talking about their Wi-Fi connection. I'm talking about their home router and the security protocols that are in that home router. Understanding you've got to understand if they have changed any settings in on that computer. Did the browser settings change for browsing the web? Has the family dynamic changed anything in the work environment at home? It's a very interesting evolution of things where perceivably our world is going to change to where we will have a percentage of our workforce permanently work from home. Not just during the pandemic, but permanently. So we're going to see a home office environment become a pretty normal thing. And the management of that home office environment, I think, is an area that needs to be addressed to a greater degree. So what that requires is the ability to schedule this out, remotely connect into that environment and do a diagnostic, do a checkup, do a full checkup in that environment. You've got to make sure that all of the protections are in place, that antivirus hasn't been affected, that the machine itself isn't infected with some sort of malware, that the VPN is still secure, multi-factor authentication is still in place, all the little things that should be checked out. So I would say that's an area where we see the need for more improvement, is not just the initial setup, enabling people to communicate, enabling people to do their job, but now there's the maintenance aspect. It's staying secure over time. Threats change, you can't say we've solved all our problems today for security. That's never going to be the case.
we wrote the plan, we put it on the shelf, and we're good to go. That's not the world that you inhabit. Well, that's a good segue, actually. I know with your help, we at Meritas just recently revisited with you the standards that we have in place, and we're getting ready to roll out the new assessment questions to our members. Maybe could you take a moment and give us some of the key highlights of the adjustments that you made with us, and to your point about kind of constantly maintaining. If I'm correct on the timeline, we had a set of standards in place in 2018, and in that time period, you've recommended that we make a few adjustments, if I've understood that correctly. So maybe you could highlight a couple of the key areas that you looked at when we sat down to do that revisit.
Yeah, I'll just summarize it this way. The standards that Meritas rolled out that we worked together with you on are emblematic of the core best practices internationally that are recognized throughout Europe, throughout North America, and even South America. But those 10 standards that have been established are rails or frameworks for a firm to basically gauge against. Do we have a plan in each of these 10 areas? Those are core areas of cybersecurity controls that need to be spelled out in terms of policies and procedures. What we did when we adjusted them is to bring them current with the latest regulatory changes that we saw happening, as well as business trending, industry trending. And we simplified many of the standards based on experience, based on working with several firms on evaluating those standards. We found ways to simplify some of the standards and the language in those standards, which helps firms better evaluate how they're doing. So there was that was one of the improvements that was made, is simplify the language and the concept so that firms can better evaluate. But the one big change that was made is we felt compelled to recommend a privacy rights management standard, as we see regulatory wise, but also industry wise now, consumer privacy rights has become a forefront issue. If you look at anything in the news about Google being under fire, or Facebook being under fire, or Twitter being under fire, many other companies are under fire for their privacy rights, for the way they protect or don't protect the consumer. Well, this is just surface evidence of what's happening under the scenes, which is regulatorily at the federal level, at the international level, and at the state level here in the United States. laws have been passed that mandate that businesses provide certain rights to the consumer in terms of how they can manage their data within your organization. So we all collect information about our customers. Customers have a right to know how you're using it, and they have a right to dictate whether you can sell it, share it, or do nothing with it, or delete it, redact it all. Those laws, the two most prominent ones would be the GDPR law out of Europe. That was the first one that really focused in on consumer rights, and California came close behind that within a year or two, the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act. There are 11 to 14 other states now in motion with the same type of a consumer privacy rights law. So there is a regulatory underbelly to this that needs to be addressed. And we felt like that needed to be added in, especially for law firms. Privacy is huge within the legal industry. So this just basically put this on the radar for firms, saying this is now a best practice. If you don't want to consider it just regulatorily, it's still a best practice, no matter how you look at it. So that was one new standard that was updated and added to the list.
Okay, great. Well, I appreciate that. And I imagine that this will be an ongoing effort in partnership with you to kind of keep us aware of where these changes might be coming. And I thought maybe before we close out here, if you could talk a little bit about that, the relationship with industry experts such as yourself for an organization. Has that changed perhaps? Do you see your relationship with clients evolving as these threats and regulatory overlays have been evolving? What do you recommend kind of as best practices in terms of how a client works well with an organization like yours?
Yeah, very good question. There's two roads you can choose to take. Let's first establish the fact that every business, every law firm must have in place a formalized, documented information security plan and privacy plan, right? That meets specific standards, even regulatory requirements. Everybody has to have that plan in place. And that is a living plan. It does not, you can't set it on a shelf and forget about it. So there's two roads you can go by. You can hire a chief compliance officer. You can hire a chief information security officer who has deep background in the regulatory space, who will drive the objectives for your firm, who will set the standards, who will help write policies and procedures that meet these standards. So you can bring that in-house. That's your first path. The second path, of course, is to find experts who will provide that expertise to you and then translate that for you for your firm so that you can then execute on a plan. The first plan of bringing in that kind of expertise, not only is it expensive, but good luck finding it. To find somebody who has that type of experience and background is expensive, but it's rare. It's a newer area, it's a newer field. Many chief technology officers or chief information security officers are getting better at understanding it. Many firms actually have a cybersecurity or a privacy practice where they have attorneys who are well versed in the regulatory side of this. But there's a crossover between knowledge of these best practices and then the implementation of these best practices. There's a crossover there. What companies like us, what we do and where we see the industry evolving is not bringing in-house a chief compliance officer, but finding a good partner to work with who just basically stays current with everything. Like you would outsource, financial auditing. You may have a CFO that could do a lot of this yourselves, but you really ought to have a third party kind of having oversight and audit control, right? Similar type of a concept when it comes to cybersecurity standards. The IT staff is going to do a pretty good job of managing and maintaining what they have control over in IT, but these policies and procedures are much more expansive beyond IT. They get into human resources and physical safeguards, your office environment itself, the remote work environment, It gets into breach response planning. How do you deal with an incident if it happens? And there's an IT component there, but there's also a legal component there. There's a regulatory component there. And so you can understand these things, but to execute and actually implement is a different story. And in our opinion, it typically takes an outside company like us to step in to evaluate where the firm is, help pinpoint weaknesses, help pinpoint compliance problems, and then set out to go fix those with a roadmap. But as things go, hackers don't sit back and just, you know, never progress. They don't build it once and they're done. They literally every month our industry changes. Literally every month we are finding new things that need to be done to defend ourselves and defend our customer data, our client data. So this is a living process, and it needs to become a part of management from a boardroom discussion level all the way down. And upper management should have adequate reporting on how the firm is doing on these standards. They should be aware of what the standards are at a high level and then understand a status report. It's like, well, how are we doing here? And so there should be that type of balance within the organization, but to achieve that, oftentimes it just requires an outside expert to help the team keep current with it. Like that privacy rights management, if we, you know, weren't working together with our clients and saying, did you hear about the new California law? By the way, there's 11 to 14 other ones coming right behind it. And there's 2 federal laws in the United States being proposed on this same subject, possibly in the 2021 legislative session, they'll come through, right? We're staying in tune with this so that our clients don't have to do that. That makes your life a whole lot easier. What we find is it's best to stay focused on your core. Do what you do best. And have the experts help fill the gaps. That's actually a much more affordable. To me, it's a smarter way to go, because companies like us, that's what we do full time. We watch people's back doors like this all day long. So.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. And I know certainly from Meritas's perspective, we've really valued having a partnership with you, and it's allowed us to, as an organization, to stay ahead of a lot of these shifts and anticipate that. So I appreciate you kind of describing how that relationship can benefit other organizations as well. Well, James, thank you so much for taking some time and sharing both your insights as well as some of the specific things that we've been working on together with our members. I know that if they should have questions, they can go to the Meritas team, and we'll be happy to put them in touch with you. And we look forward to continuing to working together.
Yep, happy to help.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.